These past 4 years have easily been the most forming time of my life, and I owe it in large part to my professors, specifically Dr. Reardon, Dr. Licky, Dr. Wysocki, and Dr. Wren. My family, who with the exception of my loving sister, has actually driven from Florida to join us here today. Mom, that's going to be incredibly distracting. My dearest friends, especially those who have helped me throughout this process, Helen, Kevin, Abigail, Alexis, Alex, Vincent, Hannah, and John. But of course, it is only right to give due thanks to God. It's our Lord who led me here today and who led me to pursue the topic of which I am about to present. My time here at the Abbey has taught me to examine the world through a Christian lens, specifically those political and economic structures that we have come to accept as the only possible options, which brings me to my thesis presentation. The socioeconomic system of distributism, capitalism according to Catholic social teaching. Capitalism and socialism may be viewed at a cursory level as vacant structural economic theories. These theories, at a cursory level, are vacant insofar as they are solely theoretical. However, they are informed by particular ways of thinking and cannot be fully divorced from the guiding principles in which they are rooted. By identifying the surface tenets that these structural economic theories support, one may more readily understand the variety of colors and flavors that lend themselves to these theories. In a vacuum, capitalism may be understood as simply the model in which trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Conversely, socialism is the economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. It is important here to notice that these definitions are vague, and intentionally so. Vagueness allows for clarification, and either structure may be clarified through a multiplicity of lenses. Capitalism and socialism as structural economic theories do not actually exist. Rather, the systems by which particular countries operate are not only mere structural economic theories of capitalism and socialism, but socioeconomic systems that have been actualized by the society's general dispositions. Because man is a rational and social being, he perceives the world through a lens that is largely informed by his culture and said culture's customs, mores, values, and virtues. The people's general way of thinking, or more appropriately, the subjectivity, informs the structural economic theories of capitalism and socialism to realize the various socioeconomic systems of the world. Simply put, structural economic theories are not fully actualized without being informed by the subjectivity of a particular society or culture. And when the two are married, the respective socioeconomic system is realized. To exemplify this formula, I'll briefly point to the socioeconomic systems of communistic socialism and democratic socialism, and then turn my attention to free market capitalism as the most accepted system of the West. Communistic socialism. In his most infamous text, the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx highlights a struggle among two particular classes that have come to exist through the supposedly inevitable shortcomings of capitalism: the proletariat, or the working class, and the bourgeoisie, or the owning class. As he said, I hope I pronounced that right. These classes, according to Marx, face an existential social divide because as capitalism has come to realize itself in the West, capital and the means of production have slowly been more and more concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. In turn, the end of history will be actualized by the violent revolution of the proletariat, which in turn will give birth to the communist state. Thus, Marxism as a subjectivity is the recognition of an inevitable social divide by the doings of capitalism and its remedy through ownership of property and goods in total community. Therefore, communistic socialism seems to be the marriage of the subjectivity of Marxism with the structural economic theory of socialism. Democratic socialism, excuse me. As a driving principle in his political message during the presidential race of 2016, Senator Sanders recognized particular economic and social disparities in the United States. The Bernie Sanders campaign appealed to minorities, LGBT communities, and impoverished persons, specifically by promising to fight for their equality. Thus, the subjectivity that seems to lend itself to the structural economic theory of socialism, in this particular case, is collectivism. Collectivism stresses the importance of our particular group of people over the individual, as may be identified by some kind of supposed disadvantage. Sanders argued that to remedy these disparities, the state ought to provide for those who struggle to provide for themselves through policies such as free health care and a living wage. Through progressive tax policies that specifically target those at the higher end of the economic spectrum, the democratic socialist claimed that he would provide for those who could not provide for themselves. Thus, socialism, as it is informed by the subjectivity of collectivism, realizes itself as democratic socialism. Free market capitalism. In turning our attention to free market capitalism, I'd like to identify the vague axiom of the American dream. According to American novelist Thomas Wolfe, the American dream promises to every man, regardless of his birth, his shining golden opportunity, the right to live, to work, to be himself, and to become whatever thing his manhood and his vision can combine to make him. The social vision of the United States is that each individual is granted an equal opportunity at pursuing what he or she hopes to become. This necessitates, of course, hard work and self-sufficiency. This American ethos is one of self-responsibility, self-action, and self-worth. While these are certainly positive values to hold in a society, the American subjectivity, or more accurately, individualism, bears negative effects as well. Note the language used by Wolfe. The American novelist speaks much of he, and not at all of they. This is largely due to the fact that the subjectivity of individualism holds the individual to be the point of emphasis in society. Individualism maintains a plethora of meanings and understandings, though simply put, individualism is as follows. Man is on his own. This ambiguous maxim recognizes both the positives and negatives of individualism, as independence allows for man to grow by his own merit, but by his independence he is isolated and void of authentic interdependent relations. Moreover, individualism, as it stresses the importance of self-action and self-responsibility, implies that each man is not responsible for the well-being of others. Rather, each man through the individualist lens is responsible for his own well-being and sustenance. As man is on his own in the individualist lens, it is imperative that he be allowed to act in accordance with his desires, void of any hindrance. Thus, freedom according to the individualist is the ability of an individual to act without the impositions of externalities. So long as the individual's means or ends are not violent or oppressive to another's pursuit of happiness, that individual maintains a right to act in accordance with his desires. As Austrian economist Murray N. Rothbard defines it, the free market is a summary term for an array of exchanges that take place in a society. Rothbard continues, each exchange is undertaken as a voluntary agreement between two people or between groups of people represented by agents. In theory, this glorified market system allows for individuals to accumulate capital and climb the tower of material status, so long as the market remains unhampered by excessive government regulations. However, as the American subjectivity is individualism, this form of capitalism, free market capitalism, only truly allows for persons to freely participate in the market in the individualistic sense of the word free. Freedom, as understood by classical liberalism, the foundation of free market capitalism, is the ability to act as desired without external impositions. Conversely, freedom, as defined by the Catholic Church, is the ability to pursue the good. This, of course, implies impositions that the free marketeer may not be so comfortable with. Thus, as the so-called free market finds its roots in the classical liberalist notion of freedom, it is only free insofar as the individuals are at liberty to pursue their desires. This form of capitalism, as it seeks to serve the classical liberal notion of freedom, naturally constructs a socioeconomic system in which capital becomes concentrated into the hands of the few. This centralized form of capitalism, because of its individualistic roots, concerns itself solely with efficiency to maximize profits, despite residual effects on those involved in the market. Consider the consolidation of United States farms due to the industry of agribusiness. In 1950, there were roughly 5.65 million active farms at an average size of 213 acres. Whereas in 2000, the number of active farms dropped to 2.17 million, and the average farm size became 434 acres. This consolidation in the name of profit and efficiency led to the desolation of rural communities across the United States. Free market capitalism, in seeking to most effectively fulfill the desires of the individual, fails to take into consideration the dignity of the human person. Distributism. Pope St. John Paul II, in his papal encyclical Centesimus Annus, simultaneously recognizes the shortcomings of free market capitalism while recognizing the value of the essential tenets of the structural economic theory of capitalism. Therefore, the faults of the free market system stem not from the cursory notion of capitalism as aforementioned, but rather from the subjectivity of individualism, of which free market capitalism finds its roots. Thus, capitalism may be redeemed through greater subjectivity, perhaps that of the Catholic Church in her social teaching. The Catholic Church's social teaching is predicated on one fundamental concept, that man is made in the image and likeness of God. In pointing to the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, Pope St. John Paul II recognizes the affirmation of man's dignity as he is God's intimate creation as Thomistic personalism. As Jove Jim S. Aguas explains, the Thomistic theological personalism is primarily based on the concept of the person as it is applied to the Trinity and the Incarnation. As Thomistic personalism calls for the recognition of man's imago Dei, it also recognizes man's essential social nature. In his rational dignity, man exists not as an individual isolated unit, as individualism supposes, but rather as a person in communion with other persons tethered by a web of social relations. The sociality of man reflects his transcendent dignity as he is made in God's image, who inherently exists in community in the form of the Trinity. The socioeconomic system brought about by the marriage of Thomistic personalism and capitalism would necessarily be one that readily serves the twofold principles of church social teaching. Firstly, that man's imago Dei is recognized and respected accordingly, and secondly, that the social nature that blossoms from man's imago Dei be supported and nurtured. The socioeconomic system of distributism, rooted in the papal encyclical of Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, seeks to uphold said principles. 20th century English thinkers G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc developed the foundations left by Pope Leo XIII in their respective works, The Outline of Sanity and The Servile State. And echoing the Church's social teaching, the two Englishmen urged for a socioeconomic system in which productive property was decentralized and widespread ownership, and local community life was the emphasis of social society. By means of social, commercial, and perhaps political action, distributism grants necessary freedoms that allow for him to act freely in light of Catholic social teaching. Thus, in order to exemplify how the socioeconomic system of distributism most closely upholds the Church's teaching, I will examine 6 facets of distributism. First, to explore man's imago Dei, how man's imago Dei is recognized and preserved, I will discuss the importance of private property, the tenet of subsidiarity, and man's objective theological work. Then, to highlight how distributism nurtures man's transcendent social nature, I will highlight the tenet of solidarity, the nature of community, and the Barrian notion of affection and how it serves man's interdependence. Throughout the discussion, I will reference tendencies of the free market because it is so often considered to be the only acceptable realization of capitalism, despite the Church's evident opposition. Section 1, his image and likeness, private property. To comprehend this distributist understanding of private property, the concept of distributive justice must first be explored. Distributive justice, as understood by Aristotle, is that which is manifested in distributions of honor or money, or the other things that fall to be divided among those who have a share in the Constitution. As a Christian principle, distributive justice stems from the fact that God made the earth for man, and that each man has a right to share in the benefits reaped by the subduing of the earth. In light of private property, this does not mean that man has no claim to private ownership, but that the use of his property ought to be directed to the common good. Ownership is maintained by the Church to be an essential right. In Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII recognizes it must be within man's right to possess things not merely for temporary and momentary use, but to have them and to hold them in stable and permanent possession. He must not have things that perish in use, but also which continue for further use in after time. Pope Leo XIII highlights that it is essential for man, as he is rational by nature, to maintain private ownership so that he may satisfy not just his needs of today, but also those of tomorrow. However, while the ownership of property is a right, insofar as it is essential for man, as a rational being, to satiate not only of the present, but also of the future, the ultimate use of the property ought to be directed towards the good of the community. Pope John Paul II asserts, the possession of material goods is not an absolute right, and that its limits are inscribed in its very nature as a human right. The philosopher Pope recognizes that as man essentially maintains a transcendent social nature that derives from the Trinitarian nature of God, the limits inscribed to the use of property are necessarily tethered to the good of the community. This is not to say that if man does not direct the use of his property to the common purpose of goods, that he is simply making an uncharitable choice, but rather that he's acting contrary to his nature as a human person. Pope John Paul II continues, the right to private ownership, while marked by freedom, is subordinated to their original common destination as created goods, as well as to the will of Jesus Christ as expressed in the gospel. Thus, in the possession of private property, man maintains a human right to the use of his property, but that use is to be directed towards the common good of his community. In quoting St. Thomas Aquinas, Pope Leo XIII makes clear that the use of private property ought ultimately be directed towards the common purpose of goods. Pope Leo XIII states, but if the question be asked, how must one's possessions be used? The Church replies without hesitation that man should not consider material possessions his own, but as common to all. Subsidiarity. As each principle of distributism is, the tenet of subsidiarity is informed by the writings of the magisterium. In the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, Pius XI argues, it is an injustice, a grave evil, and a disturbance of right order for larger and higher organizations to arrogate to itself functions which can be performed efficiently by smaller and lower bodies. The principle of subsidiarity urges that duties are best fulfilled at the smallest appropriate structures of organization. The principle of subsidiarity recognizes that if smaller bodies may appropriately perform particular works or duties that are being done by larger bodies, then those smaller organizations ought to take precedent. The reason that it is vital for smaller bodies to engage with their appropriate duties are twofold. Firstly, that this allows for a greater distribution of commerce and wealth, as is highlighted in the aforementioned notion of distributive justice. And secondly, as will be discussed in the section on objective theological work, that smaller organizations lend themselves to more human environments that allow for man's creative freedoms. Subsidiarity, as Goodman explains, Donald P. Goodman explains, is simply a species of distributive justice. This is so because if smaller entities are doing the work that is being done by large entities, productive property is more widely distributed amongst a plurality of commercial entities. As Pope Leo XIII urges, the law ought to favor this right to ownership and, so far as it can see, that the largest possible number of the masses of the population prefer to own private property. If this is done, Leo continues, excellent benefits will follow, foremost among which will surely be a more equitable division of goods. If large enterprises engage in work that can be done by smaller enterprises, capital and the means of production remain concentrated. Consider, for example, the conglomerate department stores of the 21st century. These stores consist of at least a dozen departments that could each be their own businesses in their own right. This means that the eye specialist, pharmacist, retailer, toy maker, craftsman who wishes to engage in the proper market is forced to face the economic pressures of the monolithic entity. As these conglomerate commercial entities continue to dominate the market, means of production and productive property become more and more centralized in the hands of the few. In fact, according to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 1994, the self-employment rate was 12.1%. By 2015, the rate had declined to 10.1%. Subsidiarity allows for the entrepreneur to partake in a decentralized market. This decentralized model allows for greater commercial opportunity for a greater number of people. It allows for more persons to maintain productive property. Thus, in seeking to realize a distributive economy in accordance with the distributive justice, the principle of subsidiarity calls for the small business owner to take precedence in the market. While small organizations ought to be preferred, there are certainly instances in which larger organizations are necessary for their ability to be more efficient. Consider the field of disaster response logistics. On September 20th, 2017, Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico and destroyed running water and electrical systems for over 90% of the island. This meant that 3.6 million people had no way to cook or acquire food and no water to drink. This crisis necessitated immediate alleviation, and an organization large enough to provide over 9 million meals and 15 million liters of water per day. Certainly, this was no job for any small business, as the crisis necessitated means that small organizations simply do not have access to. Thus, as the principle of subsidiarity examines the nature of work or duty at hand and defers to the smallest appropriate enterprise, large organizations are often the most appropriate. Objective theological work. Anthony G. Percy, in referencing John Paul II's encyclical Laborum Exergens, points to what he calls man's objective theological work. Objective theological work, according to Percy, is the understanding that man's labor, both physical and intellectual, reflects or mirrors the creative work of God himself. As man is made in God's image and likeness, he reflects, as in an imperfect capacity, God's features. Thus, as God is the creator, author, and the giver of order, man is called to engage in his own creative activity. This transcendent aspect of man's work calls for a particular freedom to allow the flourishing of human creativity, which in turn glorifies the creative nature of God. E.F. Schumacher, in his text, Small is Beautiful, recognizes the fundamental task is to achieve smallness within large organizations. Smallness achieves what bigness cannot. That is, freedom necessary to be creative in one's work. Schumacher notes that there must also be plenty of elbow room and scope for breaking through the established order, to do the thing never done before, never anticipated by the guardians of orderliness, the new, unpredictable outcome of man's creative idea. As aforementioned, the principle of subsidiarity seeks a greater distribution of commercial activity by preferring smaller commercial entities in the market. This greater distribution of productive property also allows for man to engage in his objective theological work, insofar as he is given choice. How the business will be marketed, the hours of operation, employee wage compensation, and even whether or not he will have employees. Some may argue, however, that in the free market, the entrepreneur is already welcome to start a small business and engage in his creative freedoms. However, many small business owners are forced to engage in the superfluous market rather than the standard market. The standard market may be understood as this: the basic market by which producers and consumers engage in commercial activity for the sake of normal goods and services. The superfluous market, then, may be considered to be the adding of unnecessary commodities or services that would not normally be considered to be essential to the market exchange, so as to successfully compete. Consider this. If an entrepreneur desires to open a hardware store, he is forced by the competitive barriers of big business to conjure some sort of superfluous accessory that gives consumers a reason to buy from his hardware store, rather than from Lowe's or Home Depot. Perhaps he decides to open a bar inside his storefront so that guests may enjoy a beverage as they browse the selection. Or perhaps an old-style barbershop so that his male demographic may enjoy a nice straight razor shave. Either instance necessitates a greater and superfluous effort on the part of the entrepreneur, as his business is doomed to fail if he chooses to pursue the standard hardware store model. Now, there may be nothing inherently wrong with the notion of opening a bar in a hardware store, and it may be argued that man is engaging in his objective theological work as he decides how he will stand out from Lowe's or Home Depot. However, that the entrepreneur is not able to open a simple hardware store, void of superfluous accessories, and engage in the standard market is absurd and an injustice. As man is made in the image and likeness of God, he is called to engage in his transcendent creative freedoms. Therefore, barriers that keep him from doing so ought to be examined with great scrutiny. Section 2, the body of the Lamb. Solidarity. In order to understand the concept of solidarity, the notion of the common good must first be discussed. According to Charles de Koninck, the singular good is that which all things desire insofar as they desire their perfection. Man's good, in a theological sense, is Christ, as man finds his perfection through God's grace and the practice of virtue in him. However, in a more immediate sense, man's good as an individual person may be identified only in relation to the context of the life that he lives and the circumstances he finds himself in. The individual good of a parochial priest is to oversee the spiritual lives of the members of his parish, while the good of a parent is to oversee the raising of their children. These examples are simplified, but they express the plurality of goods that may exist in a community. The common good, therefore, may be understood as the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. The common good is common to a community because it is inclusive of all individual goods of the community. As de Koninck observes, the common good differs from the singular good by that very universality. It has the note of superabundance and is eminently diffusive of itself insofar as it is more communicable. It extends to the singular good more than the singular good does. It is the better good of the singular. De Koninck urges that the common good is superior to the individual good because it is inclusive to man's community. Thus, as man maintains a transcendent social nature, he is necessarily called to subdue his desires for the common good. Indeed, it is not that the singular good will be magically aligned with the common good, but that the common good will necessarily be the good of the individual units of the greater unit. DeConnick notes, the good of the family is better than the singular good, not because all the members of the family find in it their singular good. The good of the family is better because, for each of its individual members, it is also the good of the others. In light of the Catholic's understanding of the common good, solidarity may be defined as the recognition of society as an organic whole possessing a common end. In a sense, solidarity may be considered to be a notion of togetherness, as it necessitates an existing social fabric that mandates interdependence among men. As a principle, solidarity acknowledges that from man's imago Dei blossoms a transcendent social nature that calls him to live in community, and in turn, to subdue his personal interests to the desire to the common good. Alistair MacIntyre asserts that in order to achieve such unity, certain criteria must be met. Firstly, the people must be willing to understand the gravitas of the common good, rules or policies to ensure the common good and virtue. MacIntyre notes that these concepts may or may not be articulated at the level of theory, but that will be embodied in and presupposed by the way in which immediate practical questions receive answers and actions. This allows for the community to be receptive to sacrifices necessary to pursue the common good. Secondly, the community must be, as MacIntyre urges, small scale and as far as possible as self-sufficient as they need to be to protect themselves from the destructive incursions of the state and the wider economy. MacIntyre argues that a community that desires to understand its common good must be small scale so that the members may engage in deliberative dialectic in discerning their proper good. Thus, as solidarity necessitates an agreed upon notion of the common good, it may only be truly achieved in small communities that are willing to sacrifice their individual desires. When man does not exercise the principle of solidarity, other more vicious tendencies arise. Pope Francis notes in his encyclical Laudate Si that many situations of inequality, poverty, and injustice are signs not only of a profound lack of fraternity, but also the absence of a culture of solidarity. Pope St. John Paul II claims, when man does not recognize in himself and in others the value and grandeur of the human person, he effectively deprives himself of the possibility of benefiting from his humanity and of entering into that relationship of solidarity and communion with others for which God created him. Thus, to participate in his essential social nature, man is called to recognize the imago Dei in his neighbor and unify in the name of the common good. Community. The structure in which the unity of solidarity exists in community. The structure in which the unity of solidarity exists is the community. The community, as understood by Wendell Berry, is the commonwealth and common interest commonly understood of people living together in a place and wishing to continue to do so. Community, Berry continues, is a locally understood interdependence of local people, local culture, local economy, and local nature. To properly understand what a community is and is not, one may look to the nature of the common good. Certainly there exists a good that is greater than that of the common good of the community, perhaps the good of the district, county, state, country, etc. However, the people of their governing bodies simply cannot effectively know, the people or their governing bodies simply cannot effectively know the goods of these larger political structures because of the pluralities that exist among them. The people of the community, however, may effectively understand their common good because they know the community well and intimately. The people of the community exist in solidarity and are thus, despite filial differences or petty feuds, are able to come to understand their good. The value of the common good, therefore, stems from the nature of the community. And in that the context of the community, the common good may be understood. If not in the context of the community, the notion of the common good exists solely as an abstract concept, to be quarreled about over fashy public debates and internet forums. Never to be unveiled, never to be settled. Thus, since the larger political bodies do not maintain the same qualities and characteristics of the community, they must be recognized as something different. Wendell Berry recognizes this different, larger, and impersonal body to be a public. Public, Berry writes, means simply all the people, apart from any personal responsibility or belonging. Unlike the community, the public does not necessitate belonging. In elaborating his understanding of the public, Berry writes, a public, I suppose, becomes necessary when a political body grows so large as to include several divergent communities. The divergence, Berry notes, is why, in part, nation-state political discussions are seldom agreed upon. A public, in all its vastness, necessarily lends itself to impersonality, apathy, and indifference. This is not because the public is in some way malicious or vicious. Rather, because of its scale, the public cannot truly know the complex intimacies of the relationships and dynamics of the people. The public is a conglomerate of communities that differ from one another in their cultures, customs, and ways of life. These differences are appropriate, if not necessary. However, the problem of the public arises when man is encouraged to identify himself with it. As Wendell Berry distinguishes, a community, unlike a public, has first to do with all with belonging. It is a group of people who belong to one another, to their place. It is this sense of belonging that Berry speaks of that calls man to recognize his transcendent social nature, not in the vagueness of the anonymous public, but rather in the intimacy of the community. In furthering his distinction, Berry claims a community, when it is well alive, is centered on the household, a family, place, and economy, and the household is centered on marriage. A public, Berry continues, when it is working in the best way, that is, a political body intent on justice, is centered on the individual. This individuality leads to remoteness, as the human person of the public does not affiliate or identify himself with his surrounding community. Thus, the public man, as he fails to subordinate his desires for the good of the community, fails to love his brethren as the church calls him to. Pope Paul VI writes, everyone must consider his every neighbor without exception as another self, taking into account first of all his life and the means necessary to living it with dignity, so as not to imitate the rich man who had no concern for the poor man Lazarus. Man as a social being necessitates an environment in which he may socialize intimately, because it is through this intimacy that he finds the desire to care for his neighbor. To care for his community, to care for his neighbor, man is called to participate in the local economy. In his essay entitled Conservation and Local Economy, Wendell Berry urges the destruction of the community begins when its economy is made not dependent, but subject to a larger external economy. Berry recognizes that to support one's community, the community must have an economy by which it may support itself. Therefore, those who wish to preserve the integrity of their community maintain a responsibility to direct their commerce to that of the local economy, inasmuch as they are capable. If community economy is the local economy, then the public economy is the absentee economy, without limit in its greed and without mercy in its exploitation of its land and people. Berry's notion of the absentee economy roots itself in the lack of belonging of the public. For instance, the large conglomerate department store that finds itself manifested in 5,358 storefronts across the United States cannot be considered to engage in the local economy because it does not belong in or to a single community. Moreover, a commercial entity of this nature does not commit itself to any single community. Thus, the public economy and its members do not seek to better any particular community because it knows no community. As Berry observes, the accounting that measures the wealth of corporations, great banks, and national treasuries takes no measure of the civic or economic natural health of places like Port Royal, Kentucky, Harpster, Ohio, Indianola, Iowa, Matfield Greens, Kansas, Wolf Hole, Arizona, or Nevada City, California, and it does not intend to do so. It is not that the members of the public or the absentee economy are necessarily hateful, vicious, or selfish organizations. Rather, it is the vast, impersonal, vague nature of these organizations that remove themselves from the well-being of any particular community. Indeed, it is in the investment in the absentee economy in the public that a community will perish. Affection. If solidarity may be understood as the distributist concept of unity, and community may be understood as the form in which that unity exists, then affection is the actualization of that unity as exists in the form of community. Affection, or storge, may be understood as the intimate love that tethers man to his community. C.S. Lewis, in his text, The Four Loves, explains that affection is indeed the least discriminating of loves. He continues, almost anyone can become an object of affection, the ugly, the stupid, and even the exasperating. It is a kind of love, Lewis explains, that ignores the barriers. Affection is frumpy, shabby, and not very sexy, but it is the most intimate of loves. It is a kind of love that an outsider simply would not understand because the understanding of it necessitates intimate memories. In his novel, The Napoleon of Notting Hill, G.K. Chesterton captures this love in the character of Adam Wayne. Wayne, in explicating his love for his locality, Notting Hill, proclaims, "I was born, like other men, in a spot of the earth which I loved because I had played boys' games there, and fallen in love, and talked with my friends through nights that were nights of the gods." Wayne recognizes that his love for Notting Hill roots itself in the very experiences of his boyhood. It is in this love, this affectionate love, that Wayne comes to tether his identity to that of his community. As the novel comes to a close, Wayne cries in the final battle of Notting Hill, "The joy I have is what the lover knows when a woman is everything. It is what a savage knows when his idol is everything. It is what I know when Notting Hill is everything. I have a city, let it stand or fall." It may be said that it is affection that allows man to care in the most profound sense of the word for his community, no matter where it is or what it looks like. Affection allows for man to look past the faults of his neighbors and to ultimately care for them as community members. Affection drives man to work for the betterment of his community and to pursue the common good. In his essay, It All Turns on Affection, Wendell Berry observes, "Affection leads by way of good work to authentic hope." Indeed, Berry continues, "It is in affection that we find the possibility of a neighborly, kind, and conserving economy." While certainly powerful, affection, as Lewis states, holds one great qualification: familiarity. The small-scale community that McIntyre speaks of allows for this familiarity, and thus allows for the love of affection to blossom. Community, Berry agrees, exists by proximity, by neighborhood. It knows face-to-face, and it trusts as it knows. Thus, affection, as it is limited to what is familiar, may not be had for that which is unfamiliar. Man, because he is rational, may certainly come to care deeply for or about something or somebody that is remote from him, but he cannot share with that object the love of affection. This, in part, is why the American colonists seceded from Mother Britain, as she was not able to properly govern for that which she did not properly know. To conclude, I'd like to defer to one last authority. Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen had this to say about the church and her economic dispositions, and it's a mouthful, so bear with me. "If by capitalism is meant not diffused ownership of property, but monopolistic capitalism, which capital bids for labor on a market and concentrates wealth in the hands of the few, then from an economic point of view alone, the church is just as much opposed to capitalism as it is to communism. The church says both are wrong. For though the right to property is personal, the use is social. It therefore refuses to maintain capitalism as an alternative to the economic side of communism. Monopolistic capitalism concentrates wealth in the hands of a few capitalists, and communism in the hands of a few bureaucrats, and both end in the proletarianization of the masses. The true Christian must rid himself of the delusion that in opposing communism, the church thereby puts itself in opposition to all those who seek thus to change the present economic system. Those who look to the church in this hour of peril to pluck out the fire of the chestnuts of liberalism, secularism, materialism, and monopolistic capitalism are doomed for disappointment. It is so easy for those who have made their money under a given system to think that that system must be right and good. The church, however, knows that the disorganization of the world is largely due to the fact that it is not organized by any conscious acceptance of purpose other than the immediate interest of a capital class on the one hand or a communist class on the other hand. That is why the economic policy of the church is constantly in opposition to both capitalism and communism. It is in the very socioeconomic system of distributism, in the writings of Pope Leo XIII, Pope St. John Paul II, Hilaire Belloc, and G.K. Chesterton, that the church finds her home in the economic sphere. The socioeconomic system of distributism, as a marriage of the subjectivity of Thomistic personalism and the structural economic theory of capitalism, rectifies the distorted image of capitalism as it is plagued by individualism. Through the recognition and support of man's dignity and transcendent social nature, distributism asserts itself as the legitimate alternative to the shortcomings of the so-called free market. Thank you.
system. I know some of the section I think you didn't get to in the presentation at the end. Social action, sort of policies that can be implemented. This is one of the things, of course, that distributism always comes up against, right? This is pie in the sky, it doesn't work. You have the established capitalist system, the socialist system. If you have a distributive system, I mean, Thomas Woods makes this argument in the Church of the Market, right? That if you're regulating, if you're distributing or redistributing, then you're going to kill incentive, you're going to kill the free market and growth and so on. Be hampered. Are you talking about, if I'm understanding correctly, a kind of modified capitalism, or sort of a capitalism that is, you say, with personalism sort of injected into it? And I guess what practically, this is always a million-dollar question. What does that look like, or what would that look like? I know you're talking about supporting local businesses, reducing. You mentioned a large conglomerate and saying that you could have, the small within the large, right? Obviously, somebody saying that's going to destroy profits is going to run against the idea of the large company, the large conglomerate, big box store, whatever, maximizing profits and so on. What sort of, and again, this is a big question, what sort of measures, either political or sort of community level, you think might have some chance of success? I know you mentioned that there was the new Birkdale, or the Birkdale Village. That's a kind of a mild version in a way, right? The new urbanist development, right? You say people, residential districts within walking distance from commercial areas and so on. That's obviously a milder type of localism or distributism versus sort of governmental distributism. So I guess I'm just wondering, in outline, what sort of policies or ideas do you think are likely to have some kind of success, or even prudent?
Well, I think in a very real sense, much of the action that one or that a community would need to take to actualize a lot of these concepts is in fact just that. They're small things. Wendell Berry notes that one big answer does not deserve one big problem. One big problem does not deserve one big answer. Rather, many small answers. And actually, before I get into that, I'd like to. And this is something that actually my senior seminar class with Dr. Lickey was on distributism, agrarianism, and republicanism. I got the first two parts. But something that I had a hard time kind of reconciling was this idea of capitalism, and really coming to understand what capitalism meant. Because the way that you hear people talk about capitalism is just, it's all over the place, right? You have to, when you're in discussions with people, you have to have them define their terms, because it can mean something completely different than what you're talking about. And so in my thesis, that's something that I tried to do was to clarify that capitalism as a structural economic theory is kind of, we can think of it in a way as this kind of this abstraction of simply exchange amongst individuals in the form of a market. But once you kind of start to bring in words like free, right, something like that has to be qualified qualified by the language and by the subjectivity, as I say, right? And this is why I point to individualism and the church's notion of freedom. But in the foundational text of the servile state, I just want to shoot out these two quick definitions of capitalism, just to clarify and to recognize that Chesterton and Belloc and the distributists and even the church are talking about a specific kind of capitalism when they're talking about capitalism. I want to point to this quote, this definition from Belloc, and then to Chesterton briefly. Capitalism, according to Belloc, is a society in which private property in land and capital, that is, the ownership and therefore the control of the means of production, is confined to some number of free citizens not large enough to determine the social mass of the state, while the rest have not such property and are therefore proletarian. And then Chesterton's definition is that economic condition in which capital belongs in bulk to a relatively small class called capitalists, and in which the large or determining mass of the citizens, being themselves without capital, are obliged to hire themselves out to these few capitalists for a wage. So obviously, right, we're talking about something very specific insofar as what capitalism is. And so I think that in itself points to a difference even in the ends. So the ends of the free market, right, even in socialism, is what is our nation state going to look like? How are our country? How will this actualize itself in this form? Or rather, how does this actualize itself? And by actualize itself, I mean that in the most strictest sense of the word, to actually how it exists in our world. But the distributist, at least the majority of distributists, I've yet to read one that disagrees with this, but in following the line of subsidiarity, doesn't look to the nation state, but rather looks to the community, right? The idea is what measures can we take in our community to make this shift, to actualize a more distributive state, as Baldock says. And some of those things, obviously, supporting local businesses is certainly one thing that we can do. And that shouldn't be, that should be recognized actually as probably amongst the most influential and decisive choices that we can make as I spoke of earlier, to support our local economy. Right, so where socialists might seek to redistribute property through the hands of the state, distributists call for persons to make a change through conscious commercial choices. Thus, if and when you can afford to, you choose the less convenient option and the less familiar option, right? I mean, just kind of an example of this is the other day, I was hungry. The first thing that came to mind was like, I don't want the calf. Second thing that came to mind was, I guess I'll grab Chick-fil-A, right? And that's been like, that's in all of us. Well, I won't speak for all of you, but I know it's in me. And I know that disposition is a product of my condition, right? And so that's an active choice in exposing myself to the thoughts of these men and women, Dorothy Day. That I have to consciously recognize that, okay, there's a greater good here, that I have to sacrifice what may be more familiar, more easy, to pursue this greater good and support my local economy.
So you would say this is more a kind of community politics with a small p, sort of ground up thing, because I guess I'm thinking of McIntyre because these kind of values are not going to be realized immediately at the state level or the national level, right? So it can't be governmental action. In fact, well, Rawls would actually agree too, right? He says there's no such thing as a community. There's a democratic society. It's not a community because we just don't agree, even though he tries to come up with something.
Yeah, he goes in a different direction.
But I mean, McIntyre sort of says this that if you're going to build community, is the idea or is the plan in a way that these communities which do see eye to eye do have a kind of distributist mentality, that they grow and that consensus therefore grows and then eventually becomes something national, or do they remain sort of at the level of the cooperative or the locality? Because I mean, there's examples in Spain, the Mondragon cooperative, which everyone cites, but it's never gone beyond that, and it's never become sort of a principle of governmental policy, something people sort of admire as a local phenomenon.
Right, yeah, so this is actually something that I think is really, really important, and maybe I shouldn't even bring it up. But in making the distinction between communism or communistic communism and distributism, or even socialism and distributism as we understand socialism, in that, communism is probably a better example, but it's not a utopian philosophy. These aren't things that, there isn't. I think like Chesterton briefly makes a comment in the Outline of Sanity, in being pressed what his utopia would look like, and he essentially says everything is going to look different, right? I mean, like each community will look different, and even in those communities, everything will the structures look different, and so it's not a utopian. It's not a utopian system. Rather, it's a meliorous system insofar as we're supposed to take what we have and perfect it, right? Much like virtue in the human person. Of course, there's an end, right? But that end is heaven, right? That's really where we find our perfection, or our full perfection. So there's not. It's not this broad state. I mean, it wouldn't be all of a sudden, the state of North Carolina decides, I don't know how state politics work, even though I'm a political philosopher. But it's not that all of a sudden they decide to be distributists, and then you have this Pol Pot forced agrarianism where everyone is forced to meet these standards, but rather that in each community, through conscious commercial decisions and other social efforts, that and even something, I kind of want to digress for a second, but even Mondragon, the fact that you and I have come to recognize Mondragon and as being able to be actually to realize these ideals, and can be an inspiration for us to do it ourselves, right? And this is kind of the idea of the spreading that you would see, but many of the distributists, specifically Barry, would say that the end should not be the nation state. It shouldn't be your country. It shouldn't be the world. It should just be your community.
So a cultural change.
Yeah, but even culture, right? Because even culture is not like we can say that I even say it like the American. Well, in a way, the American culture, right? There's similarities, like general similarities, right? In the United States. I mean, certainly, if you travel outside of the States, you know American when you meet an American, right? But there are these. When we're talking about cultures, again, we have to talk about the culture of the community, and this is something that's so foreign to us because we. In the current state of things, we're so focused on the nation state, right? We're so focused on the public. So we don't really, we're increasingly becoming more and more detached from our community, from our history, think about how like novel it is to when you're driving, I don't know if you're on a road trip or something, and you see like a little historic sign on the side of the road, and you pull over, and this is what I do, but you read it, and it's like, oh, that's kind of cool, like at this one locality, but I can promise you that the majority of the people in that town probably don't know the history of their town. And maybe that's unfair of me to say, because I'm sure that there are places in which this is the case, but largely because we're so mobile, right? Because we're so even the education system is all about sending your kids off, and then then they find their roots somewhere else. It's just so dispersed that we don't really know our communities in an effective way to really make these things happen. So that would also be like that's another thing that we have to do, right, is plant ourselves somewhere and encourage and raise our children to understand these principles, and to plant themselves to realize that this is something that it's not like it's not like, okay, you're I don't know 25 years old now, you've graduated college and just go find a place to live, find some work on the other side of the country, or maybe if you want to go abroad, go abroad. It has to be something that is more, this is community, this is your family. We want to take care of you, and you need to take care of us, right? So.
All right, I have some questions. If capitalism rests on a certain set of principles, and if Catholic social teaching rests on a certain set of principles, isn't it at least possible that they will not be reconcilable?
Yeah.
Isn't it at least possible that they're incompatible? This is, if you read some of the kind of contemporary writing on these sorts of issues, there are two schools of thought that have developed called compatibilists and incompatibilists. So are you a compatibilist?
I think so, but again, this comes with great qualification,
Yeah.
right? I mean, like this. Again, when we're talking about capitalism, okay, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the free market? Because certainly they're Christian free marketeers. I mean, I guess in many ways, like, I mean, Bonnie, you'd never heard of distributism since before, like the one day in our class on Catholic economics, right? And maybe it was two. I'll give him credit. And so so our understanding of other options aren't even there. So we're already kind of, we inherently, in a sense, unless we're all like communists, we're all free marketeers. So if we come to understand capitalism to be the free market system, I don't think so. I really don't. And again, I think this largely comes from the fact that free market capitalism finds its roots with Adam Smith and John Locke, and they find their roots with classical liberalism. And classical liberalism really does not stress, is entirely incompatible with Catholic social teaching. But again, I think that if you're just talking about trade, I think certainly, right, I mean, like the fact that distributism is to be realized in large through commercial activity, right? Like the distributists wouldn't, I mean, they're just as much opposed to, well, I wouldn't say just as much, but they're certainly opposed to government regulation in the way, or similarly to the free marketeers.
I have some more questions, but I don't want to stifle the conversation.
First of all, I don't want to. No, it's but I can't start it all. Anyway, I'm thinking. I'll give you an analogy in terms of politics. The Greek polis had certain attractions, allowed a lot of self-government, or even self-determination. But when it came to being self-sufficient, it couldn't withstand the attack of empire. Right? And so you see it go away for the most part. And empires have their own attraction, which is a kind of universality of humanity. But those are akin to some of the problems of that. So the solution the Christians had always had struggled on was monarchy. And then you could have little parts, and then you could have somebody who's governing. You say this is not a utopia. And it sounded to me like when you were speaking, first of all, I think it is. But second of all, if you take utopia in the best sense as a kind of model that articulates what justice would look like if it were possible, sort of like Plato's best regime or something, I can see the attraction to it because you say, well, the common good would look like X. Right? I'm getting to a question here. It may be about 10 minutes. And so I guess I'm wondering, even though there's a celebration of the small, wouldn't you need an extraordinarily strong top-down measure? I won't call it Pol Pot, but let's say that I'm a community who starts to expand. At what point does somebody say no, and who is that says no? In other words, don't you have to have some structure if there's a... And then the second thing that's sort of connected to this is it is an authentic loss to lose community in this way, right? And you can say it's part of the system that this problem that I raise is causing, but I work for the Abbey, so I make almost no money. I have 3 boys, and so I shop at Walmart, and I'm sure most of the stuff there is made by slave labor. Anyway, but I can't worry about that, right? Because I got to feed my kids. What you're really asking in your choice for going to the local burger place is to spend about 4 times as much money. And so when you suggest something selfless, I think most people would concede that it might be better in a way, although in another way, these places employ people, the products aren't awful. So don't you just have a nostalgia for something that hasn't ever really existed?
Yeah, but see, even that's not really true, right? Because Dr. Reardon mentioned, this is the common example because it's probably, I guess, like the closest thing. Well, no, utopian, right? But it is a great example to point to how these things may or should be recognized, or sorry, actualized. Right. So I mean, like it has existed, right? And I kind of want to, before I forget this question, I kind of want to step back for a second. As far as it goes to be, like, what I mean by that it's not a utopia is that, right, like, Marx talks about everything being in common, right, and that there's no necessity for the state, right? So there is an end, a visioned end, insofar as this is what this will look like. But distributism cannot be considered a utopia because, like, again, this looks different. This looks different in each community. Like, there's like an ideal, like, if you can, because you can talk about these principles, right? But there's like, there's not a perfected end that anyone has made clear. And as far as the
Sorry, may I stop you there?
yes, please.
According to your account of what the common good is, there is such an end. Yes.
How do you mean?
Well, if these communities, like the advantage of these communities is that they actually help realize a common good.
Mm-hmm.
And so our community, having a common good, there can't be 100 types or diversities of common good, right?
Well, but there can be. So yeah, absolutely. And the way that I talk about the community is the good of the community is the sum of the good of the individuals, right? In the same way, the good of the state is this probably, well, the good of the state of, you know, in context of the United States, the good of North Carolina perhaps could be considered to be the sum of the communities. So I mean, yeah, I mean, like, absolutely, the good of because each would be different, or each should be different because of the different cultures and even places from where they're starting, in measures that they've had to take. You know, it's weird, and I've like been boxed in this utopian language, but that's exactly right. That the common good, that the good will look different depending on the community, I think. And then so.
Oh, I want to give it
Okay, good. And as far as expansion goes, who says no? So first of all, I think Wendell Berry would probably say that, right? Expansion, when you start to expand, right, you're kind of starting to compromise the idea of the community and the value of the community and even the effectiveness of the community. And I think who would say no would be the community, I mean, to be democratic, probably the majority of the community, right? And again, this comes from deliberative dialectic of the good, right? And this is why a community can do this. This is why a small populace can do this, because like we're having a conversation right now, it's far easier for you and I to have one than for two big conglomerate groups to have one. I mean, it's vicious. It's absolutely vicious, and it's not constructive. And so, as far as expansion goes, right? I mean, if it is something that, you know, well, I think that it would kind of be contradicting the notion of the community and this scale of the community. I mean, it would be determined. Who would say no would be the community. Yeah.
Just to clarify one thing, I don't know if it might help. When you're talking about different common goods, and you're right, you have several different common goods, you might ask the question, what is the common good? I think maybe when you're talking about the common good, are you thinking sort of in terms of a commonality that is manifested or applied or works out differently, right? I'm thinking sort of the Aristotelian idea in politics, right? You have the ideal state, the best constitution, the best practical constitution, you know, one for seagoing people, or ones are, you know, agricultural and so on. Those kind of communities you could say that they would have embodied, again, if they were sort of from bottom up, they would have sort of similar principles, distributive principles, if you want to call it that, but they wouldn't be radically different, I guess, in terms of
Right.
economic policy, philosophy, whatever it is. I mean, it is one of the, and you wouldn't, outside of those communities, of course, you don't have agreements about that. You have sort of the dominant kind of free market, laissez-faire capitalist philosophy. It would look at that and say, well, that's not a way to maximize your profits, so we're going to continue with the market economy, and that would be a different notion, I would argue, of the good. But I guess those different communities could be living in a particular way. Again, as long as there's agreement amongst people who are part of those communities, I guess that comes down to the question of what the community is and what the members are and who the members are and what they agree to. Because that's always the question when you come up with distributism, like, well, you can't mandate top-down, you know, regulation of this, particularly from the economic libertarian argument. You can't say, we need this oversight, this regulation, you're going to kill, you know, the economic model and so on. The community would say, no, we're only doing it amongst members, amongst people who agree to live by this kind of distributive way, and it is a notion of the good or common good that, you're right, could look different in another community, but might be broadly similar.
Well, I want to say this really quick, Marty. So,
I'm not trying to complicate things.
no, this is fine, but I think it's super important, even in our conversation, right, to emphasize the point of subsidiarity, right? Like it's dangerous, and this is exactly right. I think it's good for you to bring this up. Even though now that you've asked your question, I probably think I should have invited you. No, but I think it's an important question because it points to the importance of subsidiarity. That this you don't want to say how do we manifest this in the state, because then you kind of run into the problems of like I don't know, political oppression and social oppression and just really bad stuff.
Okay, so I am a layperson and I'm not very well versed with, what is the term, distribute?
It's really clunky and awkward. Yeah, distributism.
Okay, so that ism already says we need to change the word because the isms are never good. It's always kind of an extreme, right, when you talk about isms. But as I sit here and I listen to you, I kind of get this idea that distributism is Catholic people doing as we've been mandated by Christ to do unto others. So it just gives me that feeling, that sense of, you know, what should I do out of love for him? And so it's kind of like, to me, it's a cross, right? You've got that personal relationship with Christ, and then you've got the horizontal that is with all of us in here. What would I do for you out of love? What would I do for you out of love? And it doesn't matter how big the company is, as long as that is the philosophy. And so I'm sorry. I'm translating what I heard.
Y'all see where he gets it.
So, you know. But anyway.
I want to say I don't agree
big or
wholeheartedly.
small.
Yeah, I mean, I think parts of that, but I guess the reason that I point to the bigness, that Schumacher and Joseph Pierce point to the bigness is because the bigness lends itself to these things, and that's you know, Schumacher talks about. I took this out of my presentation because I had to get it down to a reasonable amount. I'm not sure if I can achieve that, but Schumacher talks about something like because of the quasi-verb, and it's just an example of something that we can do in larger commercial entities to bring this notion of smallness in. And he talks about essentially that rather than the Christmas tree structure of large organizations, that each department should be its own commercial entity under the tie of well, I guess the image that he gives is a bunch of balloons being held by a small boy, right? That the departments are able to work amongst themselves in respectively according to what it is that they need to do, and then there's one central governing body that does not impose, I guess, like the regulation and bureaucratic nonsense. Sorry.
So you talked a little bit about, communities, you mentioned teaching these principles briefly in the presentation. Do you think that, because, and you also said that this would have to be a cultural change.
Of course.
And you expressed that it's not a utopian idea, that it is something that can be changed and acted upon in our culture. So do you think that this should be approached from like the kind of viewpoint of educating and learning these principles, and as like, and starting in a community from the ground up to then get to the point where it can be addressed in the state because it's already a part of the culture that's being practiced within the community? But do you think it stems from a point of education?
So to answer your question shortly, and then I'll get back to it, yes. But again, I want to qualify something. And this is something that I found myself doing time and time again, especially during Dr. Lickey's course of the senior seminar class, and exploring these texts, that it's not that, substitute that word for, when you said the state or something, the state can do this, or rather it should be this, like, state might, right? Like it's not something that, again, the end should not be the state, right?
Yeah.
The end needs to be your community. And again, right, it's because of this smallness and this personalness, or this personality. Yeah, education is incredibly important, right? I mean, like, through this thesis presentation, like, I'm sure a lot of you have never heard of distributism. Like, I hadn't heard about it. Well, actually, the first time I heard about it was a couple of years ago, like 5 or 6 years ago. My dad handed me a book, actually this one. It's a brilliant book. I mean, it's really easy to read. It's fun, actually, to read. And it's a compilation of essays. It's called The Hounds of Distributism, and it's essentially it's an introduction to what distributism is. And a couple of years, or 5, 6 years ago, my dad handed it to me, and I was like, oh, like, this is neat. I was still in high school, and I didn't really have any kind of drive or motivation to do anything educational. And so I just put it in the backseat of my car and pretended like I was going to read it someday, and it was just tucked in, like, I think, like the back of the driver's seat for a long time. And then my friend EJ actually decided that he would do his thesis on distributism because his father was his father's Cuban and was raised in communist Cuba. And so he and as a faithful Catholic, he wanted to understand, right, like communism in the light of the Catholic Church and her teaching, but also capitalism. And so EJ kind of explored this, and that's kind of what, like, you know, I became invested through that presentation, through my dad handing me that book, and through Dr. Lickey's course, the senior seminar. I mean, I was this last summer, I was fortunate enough to walk the way of St. James in Spain, and I met these great folks from Marcus, where are they from? Sweden.
Yes.
Sweden, and they were telling me that they're largely socialist in many regards, but we're talking and discussing a lot of themes, and we agreed that there's a lot of problems with free market capitalism, but I also didn't really agree with a lot of his solutions. As a matter of fact, the big problem that they have in Sweden is the overwhelming tax rates. I mean, that it's actually keeping entrepreneurs from engaging in commercial activity. So yeah, I mean, education is fundamentally important. Yeah.
And let me clarify.
Sure.
Like, education meaning, and now that you were talking and I was thinking more about it, should it be approached more as, like, actively cultivating culture, not only in our own life, but in the lives of people around us?
Yeah.
That kind of education where it's cultivating culture.
Yeah, Richard Ailman, actually, I'll email this to you. Richard Ailman, he gave this talk, and he talks about, you know, essentially like what's wrong with distributism. The huge thing is that we just kind of keep it in this sphere, right? It's kind of like this this intellectual, undergrad thesis, like intellectual, right? Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't really go past that. And Richard Elman says, no, like we should have tables in the streets of New York City, and we should be talking to people and like showing them that it's not just capitalism and socialism as again as understood by the distributists and by the church, but rather like, there's another thing that we can do, and this other thing is present enough for it to be brought to light. Mr. McCall, do this. Do you know what you?
Are you sure?
Yeah, please do it.
Okay, I don't want to take up too much time, but kind of relating to this, I've kind of had a casual exposure to distributism. In fact, I haven't read a lot of economic theory pertaining to it or literature about it. You brought up barbershop, so I couldn't help but think of Jager Crow by Wendell Berry, and that's my biggest exposure to Wendell Berry. So in that book, he kind of talks about community as he had this idea of the gathered church that he kind of throughout his life replaced with the idea of the gathered community, and the bonds of affection that existed between people in a gathered community he says, perfected the community beyond time by everyone's love, compassion, and forgiveness, as it may be said, we are perfected by grace. Little questionable, perhaps. But I was just curious as to, I guess, your position on the importance of community and how it's perceived. So, I mean, that community, theoretically, that he describes doesn't necessarily exist independent of his conception of it. So kind of as we were just talking about the education and the general discussion of these themes of locality, of community, of affection, I think Barry strives to do that in part through his fiction and writings and distributing these ideas in larger settings of fiction and poetry. But
Without the jargon too.
yeah. To what extent do you think that distributism can really be realized by just the actual realization in people's perceptions of what makes a community? Like, to what extent do you think that kind of is the starting point, or is it not? Like, just having an awareness of what makes a community and what Barry defines it as and how that pertains to. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does. I mean, I think it's vital.
Do you think that's more of a starting point than talking about socioeconomic structures, or do you think those are equally as important?
Say the last thing. Do you think they're more what?
Do you think they're less or more or equally as important to kind of talk? Do you think it's more important to start from the idea of community and affection, or more important to start from the idea of like a socioeconomic structure?
Oh, the former. Certainly the former. Right? I mean, because this is, I mean, that's language that, I mean, and Barry does a really good job of presenting it in this way. It's language that's not very palatable to everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Mom, if I talk to you about community and affection, like, you understand that, right?
Perfectly.
Right. I mean,
I do.
Yeah.
I come from Dominican Republic, and it's the north side. It's a countryside where people are interdependent, and they are loving toward each other. They are respectful toward each other, and they have no one to govern them except for themselves. And outside of their community, there are governing, identities, but not within the actual. Well, they have like a governor and a mayor, but they really don't do anything but talk nicely.
They also walk around with pistols and
Yes, they do.
1-foot knives.
And this is how they acquire respect. Okay. But yes.
Maybe not part of distribution.
But it is definitely, the affection is definitely there, because, as you know, my grandmother would feed whoever came at lunchtime, and it was the same thing everywhere, and
Because she
they
recognized
prayed
that
together.
community.
And,
Yeah. Exactly. And so yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I think that language is far more acceptable to just people.
Yeah, and I don't want to extend this to ridiculously optimistic terms, but I think something that Barry suggests is that if this idea of affection and community and respect for locality, if this is truly understood and preserved by people and sought after, then certain economic and social norms will follow from that would maybe at the end of their actualization kind of look like a more distributist model than maybe the current understanding of American capitalism. Like, just an example, he decided to move back to his hometown in Fort William, and it just so happened that the barber had just retired in the town, and that was his trade. So just his choice to return to his local community kind of afforded him an economic place, a social place in the community. But it took his initial valuing of the community to return to it. And so I don't think that he suggests that just if we all just conceive of community in a certain way and just strive for it, then it will fall into place. But I certainly think that he suggests that that common perception is necessary first, and then if you're honestly striving towards that, certain economic and social kind of
Something like it's like solidarity or something.
Maybe.
No, that's exactly right.
I don't know. I don't know if you want to add to that or
No, I mean, like,
it's not really a question.
no, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, I don't know that there is much to add, other than I guess emphasizing that importance of community, but also this common perception of that community. Like, it's just so strange. I mean, the fact that, how many years in the military?
20.
So 20 years in the military, my dad served for 20 years, and so throughout my life, I've never lived anywhere besides Jacksonville for more than 3 years. And so I'm kind of in this position. Actually, Wendell Berry's wife was in this position as well, but that I don't have a hometown, right? Like, I consider Jacksonville to be my hometown because I've lived there. Well, I lived there for about 5 years, and then my parents have been there for so long, and that's those are kind of like my best friends are from back from Jacksonville. But like I'm in a position where I'm graduating college. The closest thing I've ever known to home has been Monroe, North Carolina, on the other side of Charlotte, because my grandparents, have always lived there, and every summer I'd go back home. But I'm kind of in this position where I'm having to think about where am I going to, where is the rest of my life going to be spent? And that's kind of silly. It's very silly, right? I mean, this is something that we've put ourselves into, and it is completely dismantled the idea and the value of the community. I think. I mean, really quick. I'm sorry, Zizek. We can say that, like, oh yeah, community is important. Like, my time here at Belmont Abbey College is largely in part because of my community. But it's like we're all about to go like separate directions, like, in our lives, right? Like, we're not. This isn't any kind of settle. Yeah, exactly. So the word community has really been it's washed out. Okay. Oh yeah, Mr. McAllister.
Just a quick question. You mentioned a little while ago the importance of making sure that the idea of distributism is not just conceptual. It's not just a discussion. That it's talking about people. You also referenced a community, did you say in Spain, that is kind of living out distributism? What's it called?
It's Mondragon.
Mondragon?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you maybe tell me, I'm going to give you an example of a child who is born in that community, grows up in that community of distributism, kind of understanding their community and living in that type of environment. They turn 18 and they want to go out into the big world, right? When they kind of insert themselves into free-market capitalism, or they're out in the big world, what's the number one thing you're going to notice different from the community they grew up in, and how will they be successful if and when they leave, or will they just go back to the distributist community?
Right, man. I wish I had kept it in there. Last night when I was mutilating my thesis to present it to you guys, I cut out this quote, and it was actually Helen's mother back in Memphis. I was working at their dinner table, and she heard me talking to Mr. Ginsky actually about individualism and maybe the problems of individualism. And she brought me this book. I believe it was about a Muslim woman who converted to Christianity and then came to live in the States. And in doing that, she placed herself in a new foreign culture, and the first thing she realized was that it's isolating, right? The first thing she realized was that this idea of community and belonging doesn't exist largely in the United States, and that made her feel isolated. It made her recognize the value of what she had in her Eastern culture. So I think that's one thing, certainly. I also think that, maybe it also probably falls along the lines of, right, even like jargon, right, like movers and shakers, right, kind of like the corporate identity. That's probably something else too. I think that, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, right? It's business, but I think that oftentimes we kind of catch ourselves in using in certain language that lends itself to a removed idea of the human person in the commercial realm.
Sure.
Is that,
Yeah, it does, and I'm sure in the distributed community, people are all over your business.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Like, you know, you can get an apartment, a 600-foot apartment, you know, square foot apartment, you shut your door and you're completely closed off, and that's probably
Right.
the norm. for
Yeah.
most people.
But something that's so fascinating too, though, is that I'm sorry. I'm sure. Oh, sorry. Really quick. So, oh yeah. While I was doing some reading, I found this one author, and I wanted to email him a question. There's actually a website called Distributism Review. Check it out. And I typed in his name on Google to see if I could find his email. I actually found a website where I found out his email. I found out his telephone number, his phone or his home address. He votes Republican. And I was like, oh, this is so strange. Like, this is so strange that people can just access other people's personal information like this. And I brought it up with a professor of, well, I guess he's not a professor of mine, but a professor here at the Abbey, Dr. Wren. And he pointed out to me, he's like, well, what's even stranger is that you have this desire to be an anonymous figure, this anonymous entity in your social life, right? Like, you don't want people to know that. But in community, everyone does know that, and there's value in that, right? For one thing, it certainly keeps people accountable. Actually, Chesterton says famously that you should keep your governor so close that you can kick him, right? And this is kind of part of this, right? Like to keep him accountable. Like you know the governor, and the governor knows you, the politicians, and so I think that's important, and I think that's something else that we've lost. So, if we need to end it, yeah. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming to my presentation.